Perfect. So again, hello, good morning, good evening. Welcome to Virtual Agronomy, session 3. If you are joining us for the first time, welcome to the course. Thank you for signing up and joining us. Please make sure to look at the recordings of the previous sessions. They're found on our website. We meet here every Thursday to talk digital ag, virtual agronomy, and everything in between, and emphasize on tools and methods that could help agronomists strengthen the relationship with their growers. We also invite you to join a group of participants that chose to explore the platform with the hands-on experience. Please also go to our website, fluorosat.com/fluorosense, and hit the request access button. For those of you that joined us last Thursday, it's good to see you again. Thank you for coming. We really appreciate you supporting us and being part of the community that's joining this course. Some housekeeping to begin with. This session will be recorded, so it will be provided to you through a, right after the webinar. We'll send over an email that has the recording. Just move that, okay. Your microphones are muted, but please do speak to us, message us through the Q&A using the Q&A button on Zoom. We're going to today have 2 live Q&A sessions. We're going to have a break in the middle of the webinar to talk a little bit after Anastasia describes and discusses the models and the different aspects of data and how it all works together in a nitrogen recommendation algorithm. So we'll pause then, we'll take some questions. So make sure that you send in your questions as they're coming up in the webinar. And then we're gonna stop towards the end after our discussion about the ROI to pause for a good 5 to 10 minutes also to discuss questions that you might have about that. Please don't forget to share us on social media at Fluorosat, #virtualag. Since last week, we've also grown. We've added about 80 signups. We're now almost 440 signups. So please, thank you for spreading the word. Thank you for coming. And remember, you can always go to the recording and rewatch the video. Please make sure that you're giving us questions, feedback, anything that you want us to cover, or any question that might come up and we didn't get a chance to cover it in the Q&A. Just please feel free to email me, manal@fluorosat.com, or support@fluorosat.com. Great. So Anastasia? Okay. Anastasia will probably try to dial in again. Today's session, we're joined by Anastasia Volkova, the CEO of Fluorosat. She also, in addition being a founder and the CEO, she heads the data science team. And today, Anastasia and I will be sharing our experience with nitrogen modeling from both sides of the spectrum, the science, the operation, the application, and that. So we're really excited to have Anastasia on to talk to us about the science and the work that the Fluorosat team's been working on. Let's start with a quick revisiting. This is the slide. Feel free to revisit it on the website as well. This is how the rest of the course is going. Today we are in session 3, and we're talking about nitrogen. So let's have a closer look at the agenda. What are we talking about today? In today's sessions, we're going to be covering 3 topics. That's been our standard. Pick 3 ideas and try to convey it to you guys. The very first one is we're going to be talking about the data, how the data that goes into nitrogen recommendation. We'll talk about imagery, about NDVI, sampling, yield maps, and others. Then we're going to, in the second part, we're going to talk about how these data interact with each other and result in a nitrogen recommendation map. What's the dynamics, how the models work, what's a simulator. We'll cover all that piece. And then at the third section, we're going to discuss the economics that weighs in on any nitrogen recommendation decision. So we're going to be talking about the price of the commodity, the price of the fertilizer, how all of that falls into and combined all together gives you an idea about a nitrogen recommendation. So let's get started. And I want to start by, I know we have a lot of people from across the globe. I'm also curious to see, let's start by this poll. I'm gonna share it with you. It would be great if you guys could answer the question. And the question is, how do you think about nitrogen application? Do you think about nitrogen application in a sense of we're doing it to optimize yield, to optimize grain, product quality, optimize profitability? Thank you for everyone who's answering. We're just going to give it one more minute. Thank you. So I see that 46% of the answers came in as thinking about nitrogen application from optimizing profitability, which makes complete sense. Optimizing yield is another approach, and there are multiple approaches. There's multiple ways where you could think about the nitrogen recommendation. Oh, Anastasia, you're back. Can you hear us? Okay, great. So you didn't get a chance to share, to participate in the poll. I was just sharing with our participants today that the highest percentage of feedback today was on relating nitrogen with optimizing profitability. And that's what we're going to be extensively talking about today, and relating that to the modeling aspect of it. So there's different practices and approaches to applying nitrogen, and they differ globally. And they follow slightly different schools of thoughts. These differences are primarily influenced by the environment, the ecosystem, by the economical situation of an area, of a zone. Are crops subsidized? What is the export potential of cropping? And they're heavily influenced also by policies. But they all agree on two things fundamental. No matter what approach of nitrogen recommendation or methodology you're using, what's common is that all of them are trying to provide and reach an optimal yield by providing the nitrogen supply that must be available according to the needs of the plant. And the second thing that they all agree on is that it's a pretty complex mission. There's a lot of complexity that goes into nitrogen recommendation. Let's start talking about the US. So what is common in the US? Almost all nitrogen recommendation systems for corn, for example, in the US, from the 70s until mid-2005, they were based on some version of a Stanford equation, an approach known by various names, including yield goal, expected goal, or yield-based method. It's a method where you make the end recommendation, and the purpose of it is to provide fertilizer nitrogen as much as the plant needed to obtain that yield, to obtain that goal. So the purpose is to put fertilizer N application to provide the quantity of nitrogen needed by the plant that is not provided by the soil. Fast forward 2005, 2006, a newer approach of nitrogen recommendation became popular in the US that calculated the maximum economical return of nitrogen fertilization, which is known as the MRTN. It was a method that was introduced to about 7 states in the Corn Belt, and the majority of that area was rain-fed corn. Currently, states vary between people that use the yield-based method or the MRTN method. That's relatively how approaching nitrogen recommendation is done in the US. It's a different case in Australia. In Australia, it's more of a qualitative approach. Quality comes always hand in hand with a target. So for example, The approach is widely adopted across commodities. Any nitrogen recommendation comes hand in hand with a quality goal, a target protein content in grains or a lint content goal in cotton. So instead of approaching it as let's fixate the goal, they try to fixate a quality that they're going after. In Europe, it's also a little bit of a different case. There's a lot of focus around restricting the amount of nitrogen added to a crop. All of this is to try to enforce managing the nitrate and the nutrient cycle in a more sustainable way. There's many environmental policies, targets, and restrictions regarding the nitrogen added and removed. So in Europe, it's pretty much the case of, it's not only about how you add, the commitment of the grower goes of what I added, how did it go in the system. There's a lot of restrictions on what you have options and what is your limit of adding nitrogen in your field. So you have a little bit, you gotta spread it throughout your field. In the case of Latin America, a lot of the practice, there's a lot of their nitrogen recommendation is highly influenced by soil sampling. Soil sampling is really big. It's the backbone of any nitrogen recommendation that comes out in a lot of Latin American agronomy practice. In case of smallholder farms, variable rate, machinery is a little bit inaccessible, or it's the case of being too expensive. So most of the nitrogen recommendation or nitrogen application is done manually and by hand. For the case of the rest of the world, we see many examples of less structured approaches, which is the case of some of the countries that I haven't mentioned. So I guess the point is there's different ways to think about nitrogen. Different people do it differently. It's a highly contested subject, but that doesn't mean that one is right, one is wrong. We're just acknowledging that there's different way to reach the same result, which is a happy plant, the right yield, and something that works on your field. So let's look at some examples.
And a happy farmer.
A happy farmer, that's also very important, because we got to keep him in business. We need to satisfy all the parties involved. So let's look at this quick example. This is the map of the US. As you can see, the states are spread between those that adopt the yield gold maps and those that are more on the MRTN approach. This is an example coming from Oklahoma State. It's a recommendation of how you can calculate your nitrogen rate. This is one of the versions of the formulas that I was mentioning earlier. It's a table where you look up your crop, you look up your how much bushel, how much unit of nitrogen, you do the math, and that's how you come up with your recommendation. On my left, that's an example coming from Australia. Remember what we said, Australia, it's all about, the focus is on the quality. So you see a lot of the recommendation also coming hand in hand with a certain grain protein content, as well as certain times where this protein would make sense to be added, this nitrogen would make sense to be added at that growth stage. So the target is more associated with the quality. So that's the global overlook, where this is not the discussion of like which one gets us the best result. It's more like there's different ways to approach it, and all of these different ways depend on data. There is a basic data that empowers and enables any kind of approach that you want to adopt. So what are these data and how do they help in the nitrogen recommendation? The very first important thing where data informs us about any nitrogen recommendation is us being able to understand our field variability. Why do we care? All of what we're doing in nitrogen recommendation is we're trying to put the right nitrogen at the right place. So understanding the variability, which spot in your field is considered to be high potential, low potential, that would be crucial to know how you want to spread it. Understanding the variability comes from you collecting data. An example of that would be soil data. So as you can see here, this is a map of an EC map on the Fluorosat platform. EC is a measurement that measures how easily an electric current flow flows through the soil. So EC responds to the amount of salts in the soil, as well as it indicates the soil composition. So this is a map, we've captured that data, we look at it spatially, and we're able to create zones from it. From using the zone tab, I was able to identify 3 zones that have distinct EC measurements. And from there, we're able to infer locations where we can go and do soil sampling and understand how, what is the current nitrogen content and what is the soil type, because different soil types are gonna react and leach and mineralize the nitrogen differently. Another example of data point or data that would help us understand and better reach a better conclusion about how much nitrogen we need to add is looking at imagery. Using remote sensing throughout the season is an excellent spatial tool as well. It highlights the variability inside your field. There's multiple indices that you could look at. You can look at the NDVI or NDRE. We've discussed that on the previous webinar, or the CCCI. So in a season, you would expect in a non-cloudy area to get about, what, 32 at least sentinel imagery. That's a lot. So the question that comes next is like, which image will represent my variability? The best way to do it, actually, there's a lot of published research that discusses what dates to look for what crops. And there's also the absolute reality, which is look at your yield map. This is an example of a yield map. I'm showing it in Cirrus app. And you can see, I'm just gonna toggle back to the area. You see here, you see this area here where there's, it's red with less yield. And you can see this quite translates to the 21st of January. This is Southern Hemisphere. Don't freak out, US participants. There's nothing planting that good in January.
But it's awesome to see something from Latin America in this webinar as well. Manolo also noticed that the darker areas were following as well.
Exactly, exactly.
The higher yield.
Exactly, yeah. So if you have multiple imagery, you can use that to understand the variability. You can look at remote sensing. You can verify which image you want to pick, either by looking at what's in the literature or by looking at your own yield map, historical yield map. Another source of information that is very important when it comes to nitrogen recommendation that we also retrieve from imagery is understanding what is one way is the imagery. I'm going to talk about another option, is understanding what's the crop biomass level. So data that informs us about the crop growth stage or the crop cover or the crop biomass. They're very influential because in case of a split application, you want to add nitrogen at a specific growth stage. So identifying when that growth stage starts would be very important for you to initiate the addition of nitrogen. So what do people do? A lot of options. Some people use the handheld green seeker. That's one way to estimate your crop biomass. It averages an NDVI value of your whole field. You take a couple samples, you average it, you have a number, and then you go and compare it to a nitrogen prediction curve. That gives you an estimate of the nitrogen contribution in the form of like pounds of nitrogen per acre. And these calibration curves are specific to each crop, to a specific area. So you can't use one in a different location. The similar logic of the green seeker, now let's look at it on a bigger scale. Let's get the pulse of our crops on a larger scale using imagery. And here's an example that we're looking at. We've actually talked about that last week, about how imagery could be huge informers of what is your crop status, what is your growth stage, and what is your biomass. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time. If you wanna learn more about that, we mentioned it, we talked about it long in the previous webinar. But the point is, imagery helps you identify your crop status and your crop biomass. So any kind of nitrogen recommendation, you know when to time it, and you know what are you accounting for. Am I adding nitrogen for a plant that is reaching stage of V2, V5, V7? So you're able to identify all of those. And also identifying what growth stage could come not only from imagery, it can come from the weather data, like the growing degree day. That's also another source of reality that could help us, another source of data that would influence our nitrogen recommendation plan. As well, refreshing our memory from last week, I picked up this example. It's really cool to highlight this one idea. When I said green seeker is one way to find what is the biomass in your field. So green seeker gives you a value like an NDVI. And if you remember last week, we talked about when we have imagery, we have multiple bands. So we don't have to only build an NDVI. We can build an NDRE. We can generate an index called CCCI and other indices. And again, just a quick refresh, think of these indices as scores. One tells you about biomass, one tells you about chlorophyll content. So with the green seeker or with an NDVI map, you only have one reading. But from imagery, you can do multiple readings. You can do NDVI, NDRE, CCCI. Let's look at this example. This is the case where I have 4 points of interest. You see this area here and this area here. This one's green, but it shows the light blue because it's being selected. So these are the blues and these are the reds. The blues are nitrogen enriched stripes. And those two pins are areas of interest that I want to track. So what we plot here on the platform is we use the analytics tab and we looked at the NDVI. We said, okay, looking at the NDVI, it looks like those two strips, the green, both, think about them as both the blues, both of them are quite identical. There is no variation. So if I only look at the NDVI graph, my feedback is like, okay, whatever I did in A matches whatever I did in B. There's no difference. On the other hand, if you look at the CCI map, you would see that there is a difference. When they were matching in the NDVI, looking at the CCI, it looks like that the response, the chlorophyll content, because the CCI highlights the chlorophyll was much higher in those, the plants that were on the purple strip. So whatever we did with the purple one, that result is better than the blue one. And again, this kind of intelligence is enabled by using imagery.
Well, and if I may add to some of our customers who we've been working along the years, in last years of using nitrogen-rich strips and remote sensing, as well as the application, I think one of, like there's many customers online, there's more than 60 of you, and not all of you are our customers, but many of you have taught me personally to lay strips across soil zones. And this is what's happening here, that the western strip is in the much heavier, much better soil. And this was last year, but it's wheat, so it's before all the rain hit the US. So this is when it actually needed this water to hold the soil. And the right-hand side was some lighter, sandier soil from what I roughly remember about this case study.
That makes sense. And what you did now is just you demonstrated the layering of information. You put down the soil type, on top of it the nitrogen testing, on top of it the imagery. So building all these levels of data is what gave us the intelligence. Another source of data I just want to go over briefly before talking about the models is talking about the chlorophyll, the crop chlorophyll level. And this practice is very common in high value crops, in potatoes and cotton. A lot of the agronomists, and I know a lot of people on the call today, actually take petiole samples and then they test it, and then they identify what's the chlorophyll level. And then they try to map a nitrogen map. This is here an example. This is a cotton field. As you can see, based on the variability, there was suggested areas that the agronomist took to the lab, came back with values. So looking at the and also you could take that same logic of let's look at the zones, let's identify the variability, and let's decide where are representative samples. Where if I go and I only have 10 to 15 petioles to pick, I'm picking them from the right spot, going back and reporting, creating an intelligent layer that tells me about the nitrogen spread in my crop. So we've looked at the field variability. We've looked at soil samples, petiole samples, zoning, yield maps. The question here, Anastasia, is how does Fluorosat put all of this together? How do you bring it all together to make a nitrogen recommendation?
Yeah. I wanted to first throw it to the wisdom of the crowd. Manal, if you can stay on this slide, please.
Sure.
Guys, there's 60 of you. Can you give us an indication of, I have used soil samples all the time. I've used leaf samples all the time. I've tried remote sensor and or not. What resonated with you out of what we just covered? Because we obviously have more material to cover on the modeling side, but on the sensing side, I'm just hoping to encourage you to put something in the chat or to put it in the Q&A and say, I want to hear more about leaf sampling, or I grow.
Anastasia, did we lose you? Are you still there? Sorry about that. I'm sure. Anastasia, are you back?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, you dropped for a minute.
Sorry. Okay, excellent. I have both things running at once so that in case you lose me on one, I am here on the other one. Unfortunately, internet is the way it is right now. Everyone's trying to do webinars, or I don't know, Skype their whole team. So Manal, keep me posted on when you have the Q&A. I'm happy to switch to that because we have seen that based on the feedback, I know you guys are all shy when it comes to the fact, just let's talk and share something with us. But in the post session, like in the last 10 minutes, we have about 30 questions each session. And so we're trying to pull them up to the front. So I will leave Manal to these questions. And Manal, if you want to take any of them live, let's do. We have a few, which is basically tissue, soil, and remote sensing are used, plus yield maps. Great, thanks, Andrew. I'm curious to know more about the chlorophyll sampling. This is something I haven't done before. Thanks, Laura. So let's chat a little bit about the chlorophyll sampling that is currently on the screen, or the idea of measuring the nitrates in the crop. This is what we're really talking about. And basically, what this is that there are different crop types, and of course, and in grains, nitrogen moves very differently from how the nitrogen moves in cotton or in potatoes. And because of the high value crops give you the opportunity to maybe put a little bit more into it, or if you have a good season and you see that your wheat yield can be optimized further, you make basically a decision to test the leaf of the plant. And to know where to test, we are suggesting, as Manal's slide demonstrates, to define the zones, either based on the soil map or the yield map from before the planting. It's much better to use the in-season map because it actually reflects the current condition of the crop. And then you get these 1 point to sample per zone. And then you basically go and take either leaf sample or a petiole sample if you're doing cotton, if you're growing cotton. And then you obviously send those tests to the lab. And what our tool does, those of you in Australia would know, but we have cotton and grain boards in Australia, as well as the Science Agency as our partners, collaborators, investors. And we have taken the algorithms that they have developed over time with growers and put it into fluorescence, so it connects the data from the lab to the spatial variability, basically interpolation, and you get the map. Manal, you just showing the modeling slide. I guess I should go to modeling. Okay, awesome. So no, it's all good. So here he was. We as a team, Manal's team and our leadership team of Fluorestat, we really were wondering how to bring not too much fighting into this webinar, and we decided to go without the guest speaker who's external to Fluoresat and actually cover the modeling, because we have attendees from more than 20 countries that are present live plus watch this webinars offline, and we don't want to overrepresent one type of nitrogen religion and not the other. So here is to the one that holds all of it together. Modeling, data, and remote sensing. How can you combine these to make an intelligent nitrogen recommendation? Let's start from the basics. As agronomists, as farm advisors, as growers, you are already aware that you can use the following information: weather, planting information, and soil sampling to set up your basics for determining how much nitrogen does the plant need. ADAPT-N is an algorithm that uses this type of information. The platforms like Cirrus SST have FarmRight. So there's many algorithms that are static, what we call them. So basically you say, this is how much soil nitrogen do I have, this is how much yield I'm trying to grow, and it gives you the delta. The problem with those types of algorithms, we think, is that it's static. It doesn't actually tell you where the crop is at and how it scales to the potential of what you can get from the rest of the season. So if you do it differently, if you put this information into a model like the APSIM Agricultural Production System Simulator model, we will cover it on the next slide. Just bear with me, it's a biophysical model. Think of it as a digital twin of the crop. So it takes information and says, okay, you planted this type of crop with this spacing, you put this much nitrogen up front, and it looks like it's going to be a wet season. So I'm going to model this for you. And since we are this many growing day degrees into the season, your plant should look like this. And this means biomass at X, chlorophyll at Y, leaf area index at Z. So basically it simulates those parameters. And now comes the most interesting part, remote sensing. What you add to what your current plant is doing is actually the ability to look at it with remote sensing platforms. Ronald, can you give me a click?
I'm sorry, I'm busy with all the Q&A.
No,
I got you.
of course, no, it's great. Thank you. So basically what the remote sensing does in this case is that this is the state-of-the-art area across the world. No one has got it nailed. And we, with our academic partners, are really trying to deliver this to you. And our academic partners are not just in Australia, we have US universities as well. Guys, your Oklahoma State, your Kansas State, your Iowa State, they're using this model. We'll look at it in more detail in the next slide. But what happens here is very key. You simulated the crop, and then you're trying to use remote sensing to see if it's that close to the simulation or if it's far from a simulation. If your biomass is much lower, is your crop is much more developed, is the growth stages beyond what you were thinking. And as in any good closed loop system, you need a feedback loop. And so we close the remote sensing to agricultural model feedback loop. And I'll just, can I get you on a presentation for a couple of seconds? So basically we call it calibration. Every model needs an in-season calibration, and it depends on you guys. We can tailor the models, we can make them intelligent, we can stop them from telling you silly things like you need to have bazillion pounds of nitrogen or bazillion kilos per hectare. We are able to check those things, but if you think that you incorporated more biomass or you had a cover crop, that is something model needs to know. The only way we can catch that is by doing this remote sensing way of calibration. And we can actually see that the model was not right. And what currently Fluorescence starts doing is raising alerts. It gives you a little exclamation mark that says, I don't think those planting dates were right, because it rained a lot and it was really warm and the crop did not emerge until much later. So we're not yet at the stage where we dictate you what we think, you know, could have been right. It's always going to be including you into this conversation. And this is why we have the golden ring of the agronomist and grower. This is something that really depends on you. Manal, next slide, please. So let's talk about what is this agricultural production system simulator. Next, APSIM for short. Many of you on the call who have opted in to be our customers have used it in your universities, in your previous jobs, when you were designing soil maps, when you were designing response to crops, and when you were developing your hybrids. So this is a simulator that takes this input parameters about what was planted into what conditions, then looks at what conditions is going to be evolving in, and predicts the state of the crop. It's a system that is a living being. This is the one of the very few models that gets contributions on a regular basis from people globally, ground truthing efforts in US, in Europe, in Australia, as well as in Latin America. So what are the components of this? So what we're looking at in this simulation, Manal, please. So what we're looking at is first of all, is the soil. So to set up everything, we set up the soil bank, or the bucket, as they call it in Australia. How much fertilizer has been left there since last year? What was the surface organic matter that was left until harvest or was incorporated into rotation crop? And ultimately, what are your management practices? Have you added fertilizer at planting or not? Here, I would like to use the CEO card and make an announcement that we're going to release the automated soil type selection for Australia next year, and we're working on releasing it for the US shortly. So this is something that would allow to answer, as we usually do, we listen to you and you tell us that you don't like manual input of data. We know this is why we're starting this. This is why we started this company. This is why we're on this journey with you guys. So we will sort out the input for the soil very soon, and it will depend on less parameters from you. Second important contribution is the wind that rolls this ball along the season. It's the environment. It's the how much rain. It's how much radiation. Is what is that crop getting from the environment that we can easily track. And this is where, in some cases, we're able. We had case studies in, say, corn in Illinois and in grain in Australia, where we demonstrated that we can use a system that measures the radiation locally and calibrates the readings and how the model is predicting the crop growth. Finally, it's the crop itself is the third leg of this triangle. Manal, we should be able to get that come up. So what is your yield goal? What are the current growth stages, as we spoke, and ultimately the balance between getting the application early enough whilst already trying to see the crop signal in remote sensing is usually where we see the most tension. So I will pause here. I know we have one question, but please, other questions, we can come back to the previous slide if that helps. Any questions other than what you already have, please send them in. I'm just going to have a look if I can answer this one. Was maybe a comment. In wine grapes, farmers use organic matter addition on top of the rows and cover crops between row using legumin to add nitrogen. Fantastic. This is actually something that we have even recently done for one of the customers of ours. So Manal was showing you the zoning maps that were coming off the remote sensing imagery. And we have recently generated an organic matter application map for an orchard, actually. So very, very similar. Thank you to Acosta, who sent us this question. Can the imagery show if the addition is effective? Yes, and Manal will actually show you that a bit later. I will try to have a brief look through the questions to see if I can take something else. Is the ECE mapping common practice across Australia at present? I would say that the soil mapping is a common practice across all geographies where we work. We're currently in 14 countries, and there's a lot of soil conversations that we're currently having in Argentina, Brazil. In Australia, particularly as you were asking, it's from time to time people soil test every few years. I think this may be something that I would ask our Australian experts to also comment in chat on. So guys and ladies, is the EC, do you think it's a common practice across Australia at present? And one question that I really like from John is how important is the microclimate data in fields to application of nitrogen fertilizer and phylactics? So John, here the important question that we need to ask is what crop are you growing? Because if you are in perennials, if you have an orchard, an olive grove, if you have a vineyard, you have a really microclimate type situation where between the hills, between the blocks, things change. We have a partner company in Australia, The Yield, and we basically, we're looking at collaborating, but they are assessing this microclimate with their really good weather analytics. And we see that that is very powerful for orchards because you can really nail that weather component. And then off that weather component, we're looking at working together for us to do spatial component and for them to add their weather, because we recognize that if you are in the broad acre crop or in the commodity crop, you have a much kind of flatter terrain that doesn't kind of catch and create its own microclimate. Whilst if you're in those crops, like fruit nut trees, vineyards, you do.
Anastasia, I got one question private that says, what crops does this model support?
Yeah, so basically if we're looking at APSIM, APSIM is a platform model, which means that it has many modules for each of the different crop types. And it supports, from my memory, you can find this information online, by the way, just for Google APSIM, where we have grains, oilseed, potato models are going to be, they have just been updated in APSIM actually, and we're going to migrate to the new APSIM potato model, which will allow us to do newest varieties. And this is what I'm talking about by I'm saying living model, like it's new, like an iOS, it's our plant OS. So it doesn't do sugarcane or trees or vineyards. It doesn't do those types of crops for which you would not normally encounter yield maps. So think about it that way. If the yield map is relatively common or achievable, like in grains or potatoes, oilseed, then you would have the APSIM module for it, very likely. Mm-hmm. And I also saw, Manal, one question here, which is, have you tried to analyze crop in South Russian regions like near Mongolia? Actually, speaking about potatoes, we do see some potatoes on the platform around in Mongolia, as well as, if I'm not mistaken, cotton. So we do have customers that are kind of between the Eastern European and Asian region, because as a born Ukrainian, I still don't know where we count Russia, because technically, I will not get into this, but it's kind of Asia as well as Eastern Europe. And to your question, yes, the model works as long as you can provide the input parameters. It's designed in a global way, and the fact that we have looped it into the calibration with remote sensing means that we're actually learning over time. We're learning how accurate the calibrations are based off of the data directly. So I'm just going to read out the comment from Jeff Stone. This probably relates to my previous question. On Darling Downs, Australia, EM38 surveying, all EC started in localized areas, not common. thanks, Jeff, for that comment. I would say that it really depends on who you ask, because some of our customers in the US and in Australia come with their soil maps and say, can I plug this in? And then I'll trust your zoning.
Yeah.
So with that, I'll hand it over to talk about more customer requests.
Yes, exactly. And let's talk about, we will come back to the questions, and if we don't get a chance to answer them, we'll make sure we'll follow up through the email. That brings us to farmers' reality, which is a mix of economical challenges and environmental challenges. So you, Anastasia, covered how do we make the crop satisfied and happy, and we make sure it has, we know how much nitrogen it needs, but we mentioned that, and we said it's not only about the crop, it's the grower, it's the farmer, it's the agriculture, it's the agri and the culture. So, so adjusting for those economical challenges or environmental challenges is quite important in any nitrogen tool. And this is what the Fluoroset nitrogen tool has. Just like every conversation that starts with a customer, it starts a product. And once we were able to validate the science, the next idea to discuss that came into question was, okay, let's look at the economics of this decision. Having a recommendation that will keep the grower in business and will make sure that they're profitable. So on top of the modeling that Anastasia covered, what this tool does is that it highlights the capability to edit for economical and for seasonal outlook. So for example, inside this tool, you're able to add what kind of urea you could use. There's a list of multiple options. You can be like, okay, this is the fertilizer that I can use. You can plug in your fertilizer pricing. You can plug in your crop pricing. Here you can add also if there's any fertilization limitation. Back to the case of our users in Europe that have a limited amount of nitrogen that they can add. So they put it in and that's the max they can add. We need to spread this limit over all of their fields. This is the seasonal outlook slider that the agronomist can toggle between, is it looking like a dry season, is it looking like a wet season, as well as the attitude towards his risk. Is the grower wanting to do a high risk? He's willing to add as much nitrogen as it's needed to maximize his yield. So the approach of like, there's reason where sometimes the grower could pick maximizing his ROI or maximizing his profit. And this is mainly depending on his finances, his availability of the input and other factors. As you can see here, this is the case where we're able to input as well the minimum and the maximum yield. And in this scenario, we were trying to push the crop for an extra 20% production more. So we wanted to increase the yield. This recommendation is based on, we want to increase the yield 10 to 20%, 10 to 20 bushel per acre. With an average wheat price of about $7 an acre, spring wheat, the average revenue would be $70 to $140 an acre. So the profit in this example, we're going to increase the profitability. We're going to increase in an acre, make more $105. This is all of the constraints that we did. We looked into picking the best fertilizer with the best price of commodity. We looked into, we're able to toggle the season outlook, and we set up our min and max, and we pushed the max a little bit. So this is the level of flexibility that on top of understanding what your crop wants, now you're adding to it, okay, let me look at everything else around my crop and what would make more sense. Let's talk about this ROI. So this is a cotton field. This is the case of applying a variable rate nitrogen recommendation to boost.
Sorry, Manal. Wheat. You just misspoke. Sorry, because it's going to be important later on.
That's true. This is wheat. My bad. And this is, I was saying this was the case of where we applied, the idea was to boost yield potential where possible. And luckily there was enough rain during that season to hold it true. So you would see here that the nitrogen recommendation recommended that only those 2 green zones to get nitrogen, different variabilities, and put nothing on the yellow and on the dark blue. So what we wanted to do is, and the question here is like, how do you know that it works? How do you know that you actually boosted your yield potential? Well, you have to look at your yield. So we wanted to see the response in the yield map, and if indeed there was additional potential that we were able to push that crop to a higher yield. And this applies, of course, for that soil in that condition in that season. So if you see, this was the case for the light green areas. They got additional yield about 0.3 to 0.5 ton per hectare in all of those areas where we added the nitrogen recommendation. If you do the math, you end up with a profit of $87 a hectare in this case scenario. And nitrogen is no silver bullet, as they say. It's a bunch of the environment of your choice of fertilizer and all of the other aspects that I just showed you. So fine tuning all of those could reach a result similar to this. Another example on nitrogen application. So this is a wheat field as well, right, Anastasia? I say that, yes.
Yeah, and this is actually relating to the question of how you sense nitrogen.
Yes, yes. Leandro asked the question about like how do you see the response and how do you track it? So this is a winter wheat. We stepped in.
And let me just loop in the second question at the same time. And there's a question of, do you also use zero end strips so that nitrogen response phase can be better determined? Live action, please.
Perfect. So this is the case of a wheat field. We did come a little bit late on this field. So our version of nitrogen recommendation was not applied, but this is what the algorithm said. It said, you know, ideally put something around the 24, put in this area something around 24 kilogram per hectare. So we came in late. So what we were doing was pretty much we were monitoring. We were looking into, we were looking retrospectively. So what we were doing was monitoring the crop response to the nitrogen that was added to assess, did what we do make a difference? Was indeed, let me show you here. So these were 3 strips and they had different amount of nitrogen added to it. The pink had 20, the red had 40, and the blue had 1 kilogram. So we were looking at this and monitoring this image throughout the season, and we wanted to see, okay, which one of them made a difference, which one of them imagery is helping us decide which one do we actually want to go ahead and recommend. So looking at the CCI index over the year, the nitrogen response on these stripes, and what we saw was that the highest nitrogen application, the 40 scenario right here, looking at the CCI, you could see that it was pretty much the chlorophyll content of those crops was very similar to those that had on the pink line that only had a 20 kilogram added to it. So the conclusion was, okay, it looks like there was no point in adding an extra 20 kilogram per hectare. The chlorophyll index highlighted that the crop was not sensitive anymore. And that 20 extra kilogram of application that we did was pretty much gone to waste. So doing the math on that, and what was pretty cool is that what was highlighted as well is that the 20 kilogram is enough and is what would make sense in this case, which was also similar to the recommendation that the algorithm provided. So doing the math on that, 24 kilograms instead of the 40, you would have saved the grower about 16 kilograms per hectare, which is about $560 on this field. A lot of people refer to this as maximization of profit, or in Australia, they call it cost reduction or optimization of ROI.
Well, and we just got the, in the previous slide, this is actually on the previous slide, thank you. Thank you for the agronomists who recognized their field, and they were just correcting us that this is a 0 to 1 blue line application, which was entered for the controller to function. So this is to, I guess, Leandro, who's asking the question whether we had the 0 strip. So this is the live answer from the owner of the masterpiece.
Perfect. We have everybody online. We can answer any question.
We can just triage the questions and answers, because you're the real experts. We bring you together, which is the most important part.
Exactly.
And yeah, go into the next example, Manal, and then I'm also seeing that there's some questions, so we'll definitely have the back-end Q&A as well.
Okay. Real quick, this is also an Oklahoma State nitrogen trial. These are the results that they reported when they published this work. We're looking at a nitrogen response yield curve over here, and the revenue minus, so right here is the response yield. You see they put together different rates of fertilizers, different units of nitrogen done in different replicates. Here you see how each different rate was producing yield, and it was added throughout the season. And over here is the revenue minus the variable cost. So early on in the season, you could see that those that had higher nitrogen content were higher, produced higher yield. But you can also see that throughout the season, the applications that were added later on did not make a lot of the changes. So tracking the yield response, you could see, was the initial response was the initial application more influential? Did it make a difference? Was the second application useful? Was the third application? What was the point where it was just a waste of nitrogen and the plant didn't have any potential left to try to push it and produce more? So that's the example I wanted to share about. Here's the variable. Here's the experiment on the platform. Going over, do you want to go over the questions before we recap, Anastasia? We're running out of...
Yes, thank you for the engaged session. We don't want to keep you here too long. Please send us the questions. We get them all, even if we do not answer them live right now. Yes. So there's a few points to the participant who was earlier asking about testing. One of our Australian experts that I can vouch for is saying Aussie farmers routinely soil test, and deep black bird soils are tested to 1 meter depth. Thank you for supporting us with your knowledge. Also, another question from Laura, if these recommendations can be adapted to different use of units and the use in pastures. So for example, can the yield be adjusted to tons of grass produced per hectare for the year? So we would need to look into how the pasture modeling is done and whether the APSIM supports that. We know that there is a friendly company of ours, Pasture Map, but I know that they're not necessarily modeling this. So we would, Laura, we'll come back to you, but I wanted to mention on your question that actually we are constantly adjusting and improving the interaction between the person and the model. And so we were just adjusting all of the units to include liquid fertilizers, as one of our power users has outlined, and this is a constant evolution. Final question would be, that we'll be able to take live, is were districts actually utilizing the algorithm used for recommendation variable rate nitrogen? So just to quickly, as Manal mentioned, on the last field, which looked a bit more like a flipped trapezoid or a triangle, we did not make a live recommendation. We were kind of post validating it, but what was more important here is to show that you can get the sensitivity tailored, like you can understand what is the sensitivity of your crop. And for all of you who also taken part in the hands-on component of the course, guys, this means that you can do it retrospectively. You can take your last year's crop and have the CCCI in front of you. So this is a good replacement of the yield map, which you might have not had, or that you have not had calibrated. Here, the second point is that you can take into account so APSIM not for strips in this case, but takes into account the chlorophyll and biomass levels already. And we have a few studies that Manal showed you earlier in the webinar where we actually used like a green seeker calibration to understand what the NDVI is showing versus green seeker. And it's like, okay, let's convert that calibrated number into biomass using strips. So Manal, over to you. I think I won't be able to squeeze more questions, but thank you so much. It's great to have the Q&A as well as your contributions. This is what we're doing this for.
Exactly. Exactly. And if anyone sends in more questions, we'll follow up in an email later on. Again, apologize, we're running over our 45 minutes. Just want to recap real quick saying we talked today about data, how different types of data could help create a nitrogen recommendation. We said, and we talked about, like, it's not only about the plant, it's everything else around it as well, including the economics, the weather, and everything that would enable the farmer to succeed, make the best potential of his operation as well as of the crops. We also covered a couple use cases. A couple of those use cases are on our platform. Visit our platform, visit our webpage to look into more resources. Follow us, send us your emails on support@fluorosat or manal@fluorosat.com, and come back next Thursday. We're gonna be talking about crop stress. We have an amazing guest speaker, and very experienced agronomist that's been walking the fields and been very influential in Kansas and in the Midwest. So come in next Thursday, same time, same link. See you next week. Thank you, guys. Thanks, Anastasia.
Take care, everyone. Take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.